All right, so first thing, I'd just like my panelists, if you wouldn't mind, just for 10 seconds, just introducing yourself so we all know who you are. Starting off.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Major General Brad Spacey. I'm the commander of the Air Force Installation and Mission Support Center, security forces by trade, but we do a lot of different things.
Augusta Scott, CEO, founder of AugustaScott.com. I'm a life coach, certified life coach, and here to talk to you about culture and what that really means.
Good morning, Dori, Koren. I'm a lieutenant at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. I currently oversee our technical operations section, which is involved in deploying advanced technologies to fight crime and combat terrorism.
Jason Corman, I'm CEO of Gaping Void Culture Design Group, and we specialize in end-to-end culture design from bottom up.
Okay, first question I got for you is, how important is culture to a team? Start with General Space.
Okay, I'll jump right in because I think it's critical. You know, the culture, and people define it a little bit differently, but those are our shared values, shared thoughts, and what we think is important. And for me, it's the glue that holds the team together. I think a team without a culture are individuals without shared purpose. And it's hard to do, but if you don't start with it, culture will evolve, but it won't be the culture that you necessarily want. It won't be the glue that you need to make your team effective and focused.
You know, when you're working with a team, how do you actually help them to figure out the identity that they want, the culture that they want? So, well, what are some of the things that you've seen?
You know, there are some basics, and you know, there's a lot of discussion these days around concepts like psychological safety. Really, it's about people feeling safe to share and having real relationships that transcend the work itself. Zappos is great, for example, in creating a social construct within the organization, which binds everybody together. And I think when it comes to teams, that's by far the most important thing, because the disruptive people who don't buy in will go, or they'll change, because they will have no choice. And for everybody else, it lays that groundwork for us to work well together.
Cool.
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to ask each of the panelists to answer the question.
Yeah, sure. In my experience, most of the units that I've showed up to, or even the newest, the technical operations section for Vegas Metro, we just built 9 months ago. And even with building a brand new unit, because you take on usually existing personnel, it's not very often that you get the opportunity to have a completely clean slate, hire everyone you want new, under new protocols, endless amount of funding, kind of like build from scratch. Usually you don't have that. Usually you're taking parts that already exist, units that already exist. So with that experience, and then in the prior experiences, I've always come into a situation where there's already a culture in place, and then it's more about changing the culture than it is establishing a brand new culture. It's a little nuanced there, I suppose, but for me, that means trying to figure out who the influencers are in the group, trying to get them to basically subscribe to a new vision, and then also trying to eliminate, I think, as you said, there's some things that are destructive in a particular culture, and if that doesn't fit the current vision, you got to find a way to get rid of it, and sometimes that means you do lose something. You know, you can have your most valuable detective or some other type of asset in one of your units, but because their culture is so different than the culture you're trying to establish now in the new unit, you'd have to lose that in order to build again.
Yeah, well, one of the things, remember, I talked about planting that seed. So you know what happens if you plant something and you don't tend to it, right? Well, you get a bunch of weeds growing and it corrupts the garden, so to speak. So, and one of the things, like you said, Jason, in referring to Zappos, they live by something. They use the same values they use for hiring, they use for firing. Okay, so it has a lot to do also with people's personal values. You want to get like-minded people with the same values that will correlate also with the company's core values, people's personal values, you know, what they want for their life, what makes them feel better, what makes them happy. That should correlate with what the organization's values are too. And when you find people like that, that's what you look for. So I think when you're building teams and looking at that, you want to find people that who may be different in many other ways, but their own personal values, their core values at their core, they definitely correlate. So I think that's another way to look at building those teams.
So I've heard a lot about the US Air Force wanting to change their culture.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's other teams that want to change their culture too. So any words of wisdom from the panel on how you actually go about that? How you realize the culture that you have in your team is not the one that you want. There's a gap. How do we close it?
Can I start with that one since it's the Air Force one? Because I do have thoughts on this. I hear that all the time too. And I take it in a positive way. But I really don't think there's anything wrong with our culture. People say we got to we got to develop this innovative culture, and I'm going to do my part. But we are based on innovation. Innovation is so replete in our culture. It is how we have evolved and stayed, the #1 air power in the world. So I think that's sort of my baseline entry. That said, we need to do it better. It's not establishing the innovation of the culture. The secretary and chief have done their job, and they do it routinely with communication and things like this. We, at many levels below them, need to work at getting that innovation, because there's lots of people out there innovating, and doing something with it so we can get it to what I ask industry, our market, a combat capability or some enabling concept or capability efficiently. That's our biggest challenge in my view. It's not that we don't have an innovative culture. We need to work on the mechanisms to support that culture.
Thank you.
So I'm obviously not in the Air Force, so I'm not going to pretend to know what specific challenges the Air Force is dealing with, but I do know that there's a common thread here between all government agencies looking to try to change and evolve right now, especially culturally, so they can deal with innovation, compete with the private sector, or be part of what private sector is doing, because mainly technology. And I would agree with you with not being in the Air Force. I do think that the Air Force has a remarkable culture. I think all of our services do. So I don't think it's about changing the culture of the Air Force, just like I don't think it's about changing the culture of the law enforcement community, or let's say Las Vegas Metro in particular. I think it's about creating subcultures within our culture that are more flexible to the environment that we live in today. So, and it's sometimes contradictory. You essentially would have two different cultures under one larger culture that is not very open to the one that's very flexible. So let me give you an example. In law enforcement, we just like military, it's a paramilitary organization, generally speaking. There's a hierarchy, there's rank, there's some rigidness that's required, right, to deal with a tactical situation. Or if officers show up on a barricaded subject and is violent, they need to have certain protocols in place, certain training, and they need to have a hierarchy to make decisions and so on and so forth. However, there also needs to be essentially what we call in our area just a little bit of a sandbox where people can play, can make mistakes, can wastefully spend. That's such a bad term in government, wasteful spending. But the problem is innovation requires sometimes buying things you're not sure are going to work very well. And if we go through our normal culture of going through the purchasing and the financing, grant acquisition process, trying to get something in advance that we might think is the best, and we have to study it, by the time we get it a year later, there's something new and even better. So all of that basically means that we have to have some elements of our organizations that are playing in the sandbox, that have that freedom and flexibility to do so. And then the only thing I would add that is not necessarily part of changing culture, but in order for that new kind of culture to survive or succeed, I think us in government, we have to work on reducing our bureaucracies. So I know everyone uses the term bureaucracy every time they're upset with the process, a form they have to fill out or a procedure they have to do. And in some cases, it's required, I get it. But if we are seriously talking about competing with what Google and Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft and Tesla and all these organizations are doing, is we have to take a dedicated effort to reduce the amount of bureaucracy that we have that slows down that innovation and that new culture that we're trying to establish. And then we also have to, in my opinion, redistribute authority, right? I mean, you need to have all kinds of levels of authority being able to make decisions on creating and innovating. If everything has to go all the way up the chain and get signed off by someone up top or someone close to the top, then you're limiting your innovation. So,
thank you, Jason. Great points.
Yep.
But that fundamentally requires what you just described, requires remaking, a lot of the cultural norms, right? Pushing decision-making down and distributing that across a big organizations is going to feel super risky to a lot of people.
It's true. Yeah.
So then the question becomes, what's the mindset? What are the beliefs? What are the frameworks that people have to let that happen? And that's really, and I'm going to talk about this later, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but fundamentally, if you want to shift culture, and culture always changes and always must change, right? So your business, if you will, what you guys do, has been transformed by technology in the last few years. It's totally screwed everything up. I mean, in a lot of ways. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are really unhappy about that. So looking at that, that's not going to change, and it's not going away. And there's going to be, more and more attention on actions of law enforcement. So then the question becomes, what are the cultural norms that need to shift to make sure that you succeed at what you do, right? So that's reframing, and it's really this constant sort of battle to deal with the changing the market and technologies. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. You know, it's really always iterating and being agile and moving, because if you don't, you're gonna have a problem.